The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always an honor to be here. It's an honor to speak in this historic room. This room where Franklin D. Roosevelt stood right there, though back then it was a white marble podium at which he stood, and asked for a declaration of war after Pearl Harbor. He went on to join forces with a despicable man named Stalin, who killed millions upon millions of people. And he didn't hide it very well. For those that knew how destructive Stalin had been, how truly evil it was quite a blow for people to see Franklin Roosevelt as President of the United States, where we believe in freedom, sit and smile and pal around with one of the worst mass murderers in the history of the world named Stalin, starving millions upon millions in Ukraine. I mean, for heaven's sake, in World War II, they didn't relieve Poland of oppression from Nazi Germany. They took over the oppression of Poland from Nazi Germany. There were one remarkable general named Patton that understood how dangerous the communist dictator was. But so many have been miseducated over the years, the last 40 years. I saw the beginnings of it in the 70s when I was in school, how wonderful socialism was, how wonderful communism was. But that was just a small, very small minority, because most Americans understood, they'd been properly educated growing up, how great our freedom is, how unusual it is, and that it doesn't last forever. It takes constant defense. Again, why the comment by Benjamin Franklin, when asked what you've given us, said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it," because it doesn't endure forever. And as I've met with people around the world, from Togo, Nigeria, all across the Middle East and Asia, even the little Maldives Islands, to the islands, remote islands in the Philippines, all the way across to America, around the world, it is amazing how many people see America as their only hope for having peace in this life. Franklin Roosevelt felt like the threat of Nazi Germany justified his actions in joining forces with a evil terrorist dictator, a mass murderer like Stalin. But he also joined forces with Winston Churchill, who also could see the rising threat of communism through Russia. But now, not so many see the threat anymore. Yes, the president's over there in Helsinki today talking to Vladimir Putin. You know, my conversation with him about over a year and a half ago, he certainly understood the threat that Russia is to us. But so is misinformation about what's real, what's true. And I was listening to some of my colleagues before me. I've been listening to people on the news talking about Justice Kavanaugh And frankly, he was not my first choice out of those that the president could have chosen. To say slavery would be coming back if he on the Supreme Court, heard that. Actually, if he were to go to the Supreme Court, it appears pretty clear he would try to help the court be slaves to the Constitution instead of their own shadows of penumbras. Things need to be in the Constitution. Until it's amended, we have to go by what's there. And I've heard ongoing, constant claims that voters' votes will be denied, and I would have to agree that they will to all of those who attempt to vote illegally. That's what voter ID is about. And my understanding was after voter ID went into place, Alabama, Georgia, where I understood that statistics were kept, well, the numbers of voters went up dramatically of minorities. It didn't hurt minority voting, but what it certainly did do is ensure better integrity in the outcome of votes. I recall hearing one night David Brinkley talking, I believe, to Tom Brokaw, and he was encouraged to tell about the story he heard Lyndon Johnson tell. He said, back then, before Watergate, reporters were close big buddies with the president, and he would come down sometimes, sit in the press room, prop his boots up on the desk, scratching his belly and having a beer, and told a story in essence of when he ran for Congress and he was out in the cemetery with his campaign manager before the election late at night. They were writing down the names on the tombstones of people that would be voting in his election. And they came to one that was just such a mess, moss and all kinds of crud on the tombstone. His campaign manager said, "Come on, Lyndon, let's just move to the next one." He grabbed his campaign manager and said, "No, sir, this man has every bit as much right to vote as anybody else in this cemetery." Well, everybody laughed, except if you read about what happened in Duval County during his election, you begin to think that perhaps was a firsthand true story. But whether humorous or not, there are so many examples of fraudulent voting. And I know people keep saying, "Oh, gee, there's no such thing," but that's garbage. There's plenty of fraud in votes in America. But of course, as long as you can prevent people from having IDs, like you have to get into the Department of Justice when Eric Holder was the Attorney General, when Loretta Lynch was Attorney General. Currently, you couldn't get into the Democratic National Convention without a proper government ID. So anyway, photo IDs, pretty routine. You have to have them get cigarettes, alcohol. You have to get them to do much of anything, cash check. And because of rulings by the Supreme Court, you have to make accommodation for those who couldn't afford to pay for a photo ID, then they can get them for free. So it just seems like a lot of scare tactics being used. And you know what? Donald Trump was not my first choice in the election, but one of the things I've noticed, if he loses on something, he's going to come back and try to make the people that caused the unnecessary and inappropriate loss to wish that they hadn't forced that loss. Like in this situation, perhaps if the scare tactics about slavery coming back I know we'll be hearing a lot of the Bork lines. We're already hearing some of the Bork lines that were lies about Justice Bork. Some of those, since they worked to lie about Justice Bork, they may work to lie about Kavanaugh, so we'll probably be hearing some of those resurrected. But I can't help but wonder if all these lies said about Kavanaugh were successful as they were about Bork. Wow. I just wonder about the next person that President Trump might appoint. I can hear people walking out of this chamber someday saying, maybe we should, it seemed pretty clear we should have let Kavanaugh go through because he really wasn't as bad as we said he was. But that would be an interesting time down the road. I didn't plan to talk about Justice Kavanaugh, but seems like a very decent man. Wow, the attacks on a decent family man, Catholic, caring man. It's just amazing how far things have come in America. But I think it is important, with all the screams about Russia, to understand Russia and the former Soviet Union were indeed a grave threat to the United States. McCarthy was partially right. He went much too far. He got very abusive. But there was a threat. He just went too far, became too abusive. And we don't need that. And let me parenthetically insert, there is nothing abusive about questioning a serial liar about how he became so good at serial lying. Infidelity is not particularly an issue, not relevant really. It's relevant to security clearances, certainly, because that can jeopardize, make somebody vulnerable to being turned by foreign intelligence. But for purposes of our hearings, like before the Judiciary Committee, credibility is always relevant. And when a person has been a serial liar, that is relevant in whatever context he became a serial liar. There's an article by Stephen Allen dated June 23, 2018. Political leaders and journalists are deeply concerned about Russian meddling in U.S. elections. It took them long enough. The Russians have been meddling in U.S. elections for at least 70 years. In 1948, the Progressive Party, there's some I know are thinking the Democratic Party should change their name to Progressive Party, and there are those advocating such thing. They like to informally call themselves the Progressives. But in 1948, the Progressive Party was a front for the Soviet-controlled Communist Party. They ran former Vice President Henry Wallace as its presidential candidate. Wallace arguably threw the election to President Truman by attacking him, undercutting Republicans' claims that Truman was soft on the Russians. President Eisenhower, and this is a quote from October 21, 1956, President Eisenhower today accused Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin of meddling in the American election campaign, the United Press reported. Again, that was October 21st, 1956. The Bulganin had suggested that Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson was more likely to get an agreement halting H-bomb tests. That, Eisenhower said, constituted interference by a foreign nation in our internal affairs in the midst of a national election campaign. Historian Bruce Deerstein reported that the Russian ambassador in 1960 invited Stevenson, that's Adlai Stevenson, to the embassy, plied him with drinks, caviar, and fruit, and offered to back him if he would run for president again. Stevenson rejected the offer. That was the Russian ambassador in 1960, clearly attempting to interfere. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier in 1960, bragged in his memoirs that, quote, by waiting to release the U-2 pilot Gary Powers until after the American election, we kept Nixon from being able to claim that he could deal with the Russians. Our ploy made a difference of at least 500,000 votes, which gave Kennedy the edge he needed. So you got Nikita Khrushchev bragging that he got John F. Kennedy elected. I'm not saying that. I'm just reading what's historically available. In 1968, under orders from Moscow, the Soviet U.S. ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin offered to secretly fund Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. The offer was made during a breakfast at Humphrey's home. Dobrynin wrote in his memoirs that Humphrey declined the offer, saying, quote, it was more than enough for him to have Moscow's good wishes, which he highly appreciated, unquote. That was the 60s Democratic Party hero Hubert Humphrey. In 1976, Senator Henry Scoop Jackson, a strong anti-communist, ran for president. The Russians sent forged FBI letters to journalists claiming that Jackson was a closeted homosexual. Of course, today they'd probably get him elected, but in 1976, not so helpful. Also in 1976, the Russians had a spy among top Democratic Party activists who participated in a 3-hour strategy session with Governor Jerry Brown of California, presidential candidate Jimmy Carter. In 1984, the Heritage Foundation issued a report, quote, how Moscow meddles in the West's elections, unquote. 1984. Quote, last year the Soviets tried to influence elections in West Germany and Britain, unquote, Heritage reported. Quote, and this year it is America's turn. For months, Moscow's statements and actions have been aimed at defeating Ronald Reagan, unquote. Methods included manipulation of the peace movement, threatening statements, and direct appeals to voters, including mass demonstrations. Russian meddling was also frequent. That the West German chancellor commented, quote, one was used to this sort of thing, unquote. As far as I can tell, the report exposing Russian meddling received no news coverage. Political scientists Lawrence Caldwell and Robert Levgold pointed out that the Russians had begun to focus on such tactics as looking for, quote, exploitable differences in the opposing camp, unquote, and appealing to the people, quote, over the heads of their government. U.S. media during this time gave lots of exposure to Americans who bypassed the government to communicate directly with the Russians. For example, a 10-year-old girl from Maine who wrote a pro-peace letter to Russian leader Yuri Andropov was given her own Disney Channel program about politics, quote, Samantha Smith goes to Washington, unquote. Among those seeking to work with the Russians was U.S. Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat from Massachusetts, brother of martyred President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. According to a KGB memo, this has been news years ago, but Kennedy passed along a plan for countering President Reagan by creating a pro-Russia news coverage and bringing Soviet officials to the United States to, quote, appeal directly to the American people, unquote. KGB chief Viktor Chebrikov wrote, quote, the senator underlined the importance that the 15 article PolitiFact, which I can't give a lot of credence to, but they quoted Ken Edelman, Reagan's deputy UN ambassador, explaining that the Reagan administration ignored the Kennedy overture because we knew senators were doing this sort of thing all the time. Russian meddling declined after the Cold War and then resumed. Occupy Wall Street protests, and this is important news. Occupy Wall Street protests beginning in 2011 were heavily supported by the Russians, as noted in a report by U.S. intelligence agencies. Quote, RT's, Russia Today, editor-in-chief, characterized RT's coverage of the Occupy Wall Street movement as, quote, information warfare, unquote, that is aimed at promoting popular dissatisfaction with the U.S. government. RT created a Facebook app to connect Occupy Wall Street protesters via social media, and RT featured its own host in Occupy rallies. Obviously, in 2011 and 2012, this isn't in the article, but obviously the Russians were playing heavily in that election, and we had a named Obama that could have done something to stop the Russians from trying to throw the election to the Obama campaign by harming the Republicans and helping Occupy Wall Street movement. But the Obama administration did nothing of the sort. Back to the article, it says at least since 2011, the Russians have funneled money to groups in the United States and Europe opposed to fracking, which threatens Russia's dominance in oil and gas. And in fairness, with regard to the Russian funding efforts to stop the fracking that's made the United States the biggest oil producer, those efforts weren't entirely Russia. Yes, our ability to produce more oil has directly harmed Russia, but it's also hurt the Middle East. And you can find that there were programs and videos funded by people in the Middle East to scare Americans, to put them against fracking so that Russia, and the Middle East could go back to being where most of the oil was coming from. Anyway, this article says to do this, talking about opposing fracking, the Russians used a network of front organizations to include corporations, law firms, nonprofit groups, with some of the money getting into the United States through Bermuda. Facing criticism from Republicans over his soft on Putin policies, President Obama sought during his 2012 re-election campaign to avoid confrontation with the Russians. Of course, inserting parenthetically here, when he knew the Russians were helping his campaign and hurting Mitt Romney's campaign, then of course that played into his decision not to try to stop the Russians meddling in the U.S. election. The Russians cooperated. March 2012, Obama was heard on an open microphone telling Putin's sidekick Dmitry Medvedev that he would have, quote, more flexibility, unquote, after the election, but, quote, it's important for him to give me space, unquote. Medvedev replied, quote, I will transmit this information to Vladimir, and I stand with you. So maybe that had something to do with the Obama administration not wanting to confront Russia about their meddling, because they were meddling on behalf of Obama. In any event, the article says time and time again Russia meddled. It was, quote, the experts, unquote, said. Something we were used to, something that happened all the time, no big deal. Then one day, Democrats needed an excuse for losing an election, and everything changed. So an interesting article there by Stephen J. Allen, June 23rd. And, Mr. Speaker, it is rather tragic that we had a hearing on Friday. I didn't violate the rules of the House. Many of my Democratic colleagues did. You're not supposed to rudely interrupt another member's time, constantly yelling. He needs to take his meds. That's a violation of the rule. I didn't call anybody on their rule violations, but it's certainly not a violation of the House rules. And I hope my colleagues will understand, when a witness is sitting there lying through his teeth, it is permissible to call him exactly what he is, a liar. And in Strzok's case, a serial liar. I saw it during his closed-door testimony. Some of us talked about this guy. He looked so good, you know, he looked like he could pass any polygraph test. And then I find out, well, actually, he had a couple of deception indicated along the way, but apparently he had people inside the FBI helping keep him in his top position as one of the two top leaders, or one of the top leaders. So apparently he wasn't quite as good at lying as I thought he was. But we have got to get back to being seekers of truth and not deniers of the opportunity to find it. I mean, our whole civilization stands on the brink of an end when young people today in such big numbers think these activities of socialism, progressivism, communism, that those are good, healthy things. There's only one way you can have socialism or communism. You got to have dictatorial powers in the hands of a dictator or a committee. And there's got to be very little freedom. The government will let you have freedom and they will take it away with every right to do that. This is such an anomaly we have here in the United States. People around the world, and I'm not talking about the talking heads in the media in Europe, the EU, Britain, some of the other places. I'm talking about people that live in these countries day to day all over the world. So many see us as their chance for some peace in this life. Quote him before, but a man named Ebenezer in Togo, Africa, said, you know, our group here, we're Christians. We know where we go when we die, but our only chance of having peace in this life is if America is strong. Tell the leaders in Washington, stop allowing America to get weaker and weaker. And Trump wants to see this country get strong. Some have said, how, as you as a Christian, could you support a guy like Trump? Has he been involved in infidelity in the past? I have people sling that my way. But the Bible addresses such a thing. You know, it talks about when I was a child, I spoke as a child. That was Apostle Paul. But when I became an adult, I put aside childish things. And when Donald J. Trump was a Democrat, hung around Bill Clinton, he talked like Bill Clinton. He acted like Bill Clinton, you know. So I forgive him, and I would like to do anything we can in this body to help make America stronger. So those people, those crying out around the world for a strong America so they have a chance at peace, will indeed have a chance at peace. We've been given a gift. That's something Scripture also addresses. To whom much is given, of him much will be required. We got to do better than this. But there is nothing ever wrong with facing a liar and calling him a liar. And the only thing worse than a serial liar at a hearing in the U.S. Capitol is when the serial liar that's damaged the country, hopefully not irreparably, but damaged it badly, tries to make himself a victim. We've had enough of that. Let's get back to truth. I yield back.